Hello and welcome to the Doctors Who podcast. My name is Chris, and tonight we start our discussion on The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. Now, The Eye of the World is book 1 of 14 of Robert Jordan's fantasy epic series. And while we will not be getting into the later books, we will be starting on book 1, which lays the foundation and the groundwork for the world that Jordan builds. In this episode, we're going to talk about why we chose this book, our expectations, and that we hope you'll join us as we make our way through The Eye of the World. Welcome to the Doctors Who podcast. My name is Chris.
My name is Chip.
My name is Brian.
And today, as the intro so eloquently stated, we are diving into The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan.
We have that pretty new intro thanks to
That's right.
Imerman, right?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
I was talking to him and mentioned that we were going from science fiction. We just finished up Dune and we were moving to fantasy. He's like, oh, guys, you need a new look. You can't do a fantasy novel with glossy science fiction overlays. So here we are. I think it looks great. So he does.
He made us look good.
Yeah, he did.
As much as he could me, but that's a tough job. So
he did a fantastic job with all of us, though. Like, look at that.
Okay. So, Chip, you were saying before we started that this book is, 31 years old now?
I think it turns 31 this month. So this is January 2021, and it was published January of 1990. Right.
That's old.
Yeah. I first read this book in, I think it was about 95. So I was 24-ish when I started reading it. And then I just devoured everything that he'd written up to that point, and then it was a waiting game for each new book. But, yeah, so this is my first time visiting this one in 25 years, 26 years.
And from my perspective, I started reading these probably in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, and for a while before I had children, I reread the series at least once every 2 years. Sometimes, for a while there was probably once a year when there were only 7 or 8 or 9 books out. But my oldest is turning 7 in 2 weeks, and I've not read it since he was born. Your turn, Brian.
Wow. Oh, so I am long-time awareness of this book, first-time reader. So it seems like a lot of people I know have read the book and highly encouraged me to read it. One of my wife,
someone you live with.
I know. Well, and that's kind of the motivation for this book for me is I look at this as an opportunity to say, I can talk to you about some of the characters of Wheel of Time. And she's like, talk to me again when you've read all 14 of them. But anyway, she's excited that I'm reading this, and we're having a lot of fun with it over here, and she's helping correct my pronunciation as we go along too. So I'm sure you'll hear some things where I'll say something, and it's my wife helping me become a better person.
The nice thing with these books is there's actually a glossary in the back. So if you get hung up on the pronunciation of something, or you want to know what something is.
And Brian's wife isn't available to answer.
Right. Right. Yeah. So that's helpful. Okay.
That is handy. I will say, though,
go ahead.
If I may say a little plug here, but having just come off of finishing Dune, I feel like my ability to pronounce some of these pronounce. Okay, maybe I will have some problems. If I can use that as a reference, where we did a great job with Dune, and you can go back and watch Dune, our videos on Dune, but I feel like that actually helped a lot with some of my pronunciation in preparation for this book. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So one of the cool things, and this was actually intentional on Robert Jordan's part. The first 100 pages or so are very reminiscent of Tolkien. That was intentional on his part, in that the first 100 pages he wanted that to feel familiar, and then he's like, okay, you're familiar, you're cozy, now we're gonna just branch off and get crazy. So that's something that I think has turned readers off in the past, but I actually kind of like it. So,
well, I think one nice thing with a lot of these books are that they ground you in something that is so familiar to you. Even if you haven't read that book before, you kind of know how the world basically functions. All right, there are civilizations, there are characters with these personality types. It just helps make it that much easier to launch into it from my perspective.
And it's kind of an interesting choice, considering there were a lot of Tolkien clones out there in books that were almost like an homage.
Sure.
I mean, I think of like the Sword of Shannara, and all the Shannara books are very much. I mean, Sword of Shannara is basically Lord of the Rings, just told a little bit different way. But to take that approach, though, knowing that other people have kind of jumped off and done that, but then, like you said, he kind of gets you all familiar with this setting and Emond's Field and the Two Rivers. It's like Hobbiton in the Shire. Then a bunch of stuff happens, and all of a sudden we're completely in a different world. And this is the first real world building series that I ever read that was just like, whoa, this is really something else.
Yeah. So Brian, I'm curious. Chip and I, as we said, we've read this before. This is your first real foray. Is it?
We did it to him again.
We did it with Dune. We're doing it again. Is it intimidating? Do you secretly bear a grudge against us? I'm kind of curious your outlook as we dive into this.
And you can say if you bear a grudge against Chris and not me.
Oh,
but
well, I think I bear a grudge with the fact that I haven't picked this book up until now.
There you go.
In all honesty, I feel like this was a natural evolution off of where we were going, but also, like, my wife read this. Like, how have I not read this? It's just one of those series where shame on me, or me, for not reading this before now. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it poses a great launch pad into discussions with you guys as well as our listeners, but also to really further my appreciation for the fantasy genre.
Excellent. That's a good answer. It's almost like you rehearsed it, even though we didn't give you any warning I was going to ask that. So, no, this book series is probably my favorite series, obviously, since I reread it several times a decade ago. But I think for me, I've grown a lot as a person in the last 7 years. My life radically has changed from the point I last reread this series, and so I'm kind of curious to see if it is going to hook me and draw me in the way it did when I read it last. I mean, I really hope so, because I've got the dragon on my arm, as well as, I don't think you can see it, but
you've got a heron somewhere too.
Yeah, the heron's on the back of the arm. So I mean, it's on my body forever. So I hope it doesn't disappoint.
Yeah, I'm kind of that way too. So like I said, I wasn't even married when I started the books. I think I started my last year in college and then continued afterwards. So in the time that I read it, I got married, eventually had kids and all that. So but there's a lot of things that still stick with me. So I still remember Shadar Logoth, and I still remember, they all arrive at Camelot. There's stuff that I'm probably jumping way ahead. I don't want to spoil it for Brian, so I won't say much more. But there's elements that, having read it 25 years ago, that still stick with me. And even from the other books, like Dumais Wells, and just all these different scenes. I don't necessarily remember how they got to each one. But I'm really excited to kind of jump back in.
The iconic moments that just
see
kind
all
of
this.
Live in your memory, right?
Yeah, the kind of that just happened.
And you have that with any series. You have like Boromir getting riddled by arrows at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, or if you're reading the books, the beginning.
You have the Red Wedding. You have Ned getting beheaded at the end, the major character in the first book, and then he's dead, Spoilers for Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
The thing I really want to look at this time as I read it, because I remember, there's a lot of layers here, so there's touches on different religions and languages and cultures. But the one thing I really remember just with the yin and yang, the balance of everything in here, in this world where, there's a strong balance between male and female. The magic system is very much, there's two sides of it with the male and female side, and it feels like, they've got the Forsaken who they'll introduce, but then they've got, kind of the antithesis of the Forsaken with the Aes Sedai, and there's just so many things that balance each other out.
Sure.
So it's really ultimately it's a good and evil story. So I mean the story's not complex in itself, it's just all the things that happen to get them to these different places, and it's totally about world building. So
there's another theme to potentially consider. I think in the last several years there's been a big push or a big shift in awareness in our society for like representation of minorities, not just white men in movies and things like that, and that includes like more prominent women roles, like you see things like Captain Marvel, you see all these things. So this back in 1990 prominently features women. Women are the ones that wield the one power. Women are the ones that pull the strings and get everything done behind the scenes. There's a lot of parallels there to the Bene Gesserit from Dune, which we talked about.
Yeah.
So
when I think about like the Aiel and stuff that we'll meet later, I think that's actually in later books, but it's very much a female-driven culture. Where
there's just
yeah.
But I'm curious with kind of this cultural awareness that's sprung up, if the portrayal of women, even though they're prominent, is done well or not. So that might be
be
something to kind of just keep in the back of our heads as we're reading.
Because I thought it was fairly unique when I read it. I remember thinking some of the romantic relationship things felt a little
forced,
young or naive, but then again the characters are young and naive too, yeah. So maybe it kind of fits with the age of the characters at the time. But yeah, it felt like Jordan kind of felt like, oh, I've got to kind of write some of this in here, but the stuff that he excelled at, he did extremely well. But then some of those little touchy-feely things, it was a little bit like kind of like George Lucas did with
well, I'm also intrigued to compare this back to another book that we've done a series on, Mistborn, which also features a very female-centric lead.
Yes.
And Sanderson actually, I don't know if it was said online or not, but Sanderson was again the one who finished out the Robert Jordan series.
And
so
he was picked by Jordan's wife
and editor.
Needed to finish the series. Yep.
Wow.
So yes, that's a good.
It'll be interesting to compare and contrast.
That's a good parallel to draw, because I think he finished it out very well. I know Jordan had extensive notes.
The writing style was definitely different.
It was,
but the story was good. Yeah. It was still there, and it was still the same story and same characters.
Well, so
But we've got like 13 more books to get through before we get there.
We should be able to polish those off in like a month and a half, right?
Yeah. Well, we should probably get started with this one.
Yeah. So for next time, we are going to dive into our discussion, and that is going to be the prologue, chapter 1 and chapter 2. One thing I will say, if you've never read this and you're jumping in to read along with us, the prologue is going to seem strange and unimportant. Try to make it through. It's really not unimportant.
One thing to note, there are 2 prologues out there. So the original prologue is about 7 or 8 pages and focuses on a character named Luz Theron Telamon. There is another prologue that I guess Jordan wrote later when they launched this, or I think they broke each book in half and re-released them as more of a young adult, or tried to tap the young adult market. Yeah. And he wrote a second prologue that was much more drawn out, had the main characters in it, but it was really more kind of an introduction to Emond's Field, the main characters, and some kind of undercurrents of things going on. But the prologue we're going to focus on is the original prologue from the original
All right.
publishing of the book.
So, next time, prologue, chapter 1, chapter 2. We will bring that to you in a week. So, in the meantime, we invite you to click that like button. We invite you to subscribe and tap the little notification bell below our screen. That will let you know when we post new content, which is always riveting and exciting. Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Also, please use the comment section, because we'd love to have some side dialogue, some discussion, some conversation, things like that. Let us know.
Yeah, and especially with this one, with a book this size,
Yeah.
we're not going to cover everything, but I'd be happy to jump in and have other conversations through the comments.
sure.
And lastly, again, we do have other content out there. Feel free to check that out. We hope to see you next time, and in the meantime,
Allons-y.